Program.cs was a lie up until .NET 6. Startup.cs was a waste of space. Microsoft totally forgot about Drive for years. Those are bold statements, but I can back them up. Recently, I've heard from a number of seasoned developers that they dislike the simplification in C# in .NET 6 and beyond. The thought is that top-level statements and other major changes hid too much and that the original way was better. In this video, I'm going to show you why the new way of doing things in .NET 6 and beyond actually promotes better programming practices. Let's dive right in and take a peek. So here I have Visual Studio 2022. This is the 17.5 edition. We're going to create a new project, and we're going to first start with a console application. And I'm going to choose, let's call this the old console, and we'll call this the comparison app. And we're going to choose .NET 5, which yes, that's out of support, but that's pre-.NET 6 changes. Now we could have chosen .NET Core 3.1, or we could have even gone back to .NET Framework and seen the exact same thing. But .NET 5 will work for us. We're going to hit Create and look at the old way of doing things. This is the console application in what many feel is the right way of doing things, which is to have your using directive, you have your namespace, your internal class program, your static void main, and then your code. And this is where we start new developers, or at least I do. I encourage people when you're first learning C# to learn in a console application because of its simplicity. So this is the place to start. But in .NET 6 and beyond, let's add a new project here, a console app. We'll call this new console. And we're going to choose .NET 7 because it's the latest version. You'll hit Create, and this is what it looks like. So there's a lot less here. In fact, there's just one line of code. We do have one comment. And by the way, that new comment is talking about the new console template, and there's more information about it and why it is the way it is. So we even documented, hey, there's some changes and here's what they are. But let's get rid of that, and we can see that that's all we have for Program.cs. That's quite a difference from this. So we've obviously hidden a bunch of stuff here, right? Well, no, not really. So let's talk about why this is actually a very good change and why this is a lie. So let's start off with the using directive, using system. Okay, yes. The system over here, or the using system directive over here is missing because it's an implicit using. Yes, that is hidden and they aren't shown up. And yeah, that's not the best. You can turn those off if you want. But at the same time, let's talk about what it's actually doing. It's not bringing in libraries. That's never been the case. So you can't compare it to like a C++ where you have the actual bringing in of libraries at the top. That's not what we're doing. We're just shortening our namespace usage. So instead of saying system.console.writeline, we just say console.writeline. Okay, so yeah, we're not showing that and we're hiding that. I say we. I'm using we as the Microsoft, but they're hiding that. And is that a bad thing? I would argue no, because are you ever going to create a class called console? You shouldn't. Because you shouldn't be stepping on the same namespaces, classes, and methods that Microsoft uses. So you probably won't be doing that. And in practically, if not every class that you create in your original way of doing things, you would have using system because it's a pretty fundamental library. It's built right into the core of .NET. In fact, you don't have to use a NuGet package to bring in system because that's just part of .NET Core, even though .NET Core has really shrunk down what is in just the core. So it's already a case where, it's kind of baked in. It's part of .NET. So I guess you could argue, well, it'd be nice to see that, and that's fine, and you can show that, but I really think it's baked right in, and so it's not something you necessarily need to know about, and if you mouse over anything that uses it, it'll tell you, well, it actually comes from system. So there's not a lot hidden there. Let's go now to this namespace old console. Here's where we really run into the lie. And that is that we have a namespace called old console. Cool. That's based upon the project name. We do not have one over here. And in fact, if you try to reference something in the new console namespace, you'd have to add a using directive. Well, isn't that a good thing to have the namespace already? No, it's not. And here's why. And we had to dial all the way down here to this method. This is the central point of the Program.cs is the main method. And this is a special method. It's one that when you execute an application, it runs this method. Now, how does the application know to run the main method? Well, it just does. It's part of how it's built in. Can you change that? No, not really. So do you ever change that? No, never. So isn't that just magic? Well, yeah, I guess it is, but everybody knows you just run main. Okay, so that's already magic. The fact that this method gets called automatically when you run your application. All right, over here, it just automatically runs Program.cs. So we have the equivalency. It's just that over here it's a method, over here it's a file. That's the big difference. All right. Well, but this is a method, which, when you first start learning C#, you should learn about methods and namespaces and classes, correct? Not in that order, no. Not those things first. In fact, the first thing I'd encourage you to learn about variables. And yeah, you're going to have to call console.writeLine, which is a method, and kind of be like, hey, it's magic for a minute, but we'll get to understand what this is doing. But that's not a big deal as compared to why we need to know what this or this or this, right? But let's just say, you know what, we need to know what this right away. Okay, so static void main, this is a method, all right? So we need to know what methods. Well, what does a method do? Well, a method is like console writeLine, where we can call something over and over again, call a bit of logic instead of repeating ourselves. So dry, don't repeat yourself. And so we call this over and over because of the fact that it allows us to not repeat ourselves, and that's why we create a method out of it. Cool. So why is it we never call main? Because why would you create a method if you can never call it? Because that's really what it is. Static void main is a special method that we can never call, because if we do, we get into recursion. Now, yes, there are technically ways you can technically force static void main to be callable. Again, don't ever do that. Don't. The way our applications run is that the application starts on this curly brace. It ends on this curly brace. That's how all of our applications work. That's how all .NET applications work. They execute the main method, and they run until the end of that main method. So we have a method that's different than every other method. And we're saying it's important to have it as a method because that teaches people about methods. But it teaches them all the wrong things because this is a method we never call again. So it encapsulates logic for no other purpose than to encapsulate logic. It doesn't actually allow us to not repeat ourselves. It just creates additional noise. So Microsoft said, hey, you know what? We're not actually calling this, so let's get rid of it. Because it's the same, this magic calling main is the same as magic calling a file. And then you look at the program or the internal class program and you say, well, why do we have a class that's main goal is to house the main method that we never call? Well, that class serves no purpose. And in fact, we never instantiate the internal class program. Now you could argue, well, I put stuff in there all the time. But should you? Maybe that's not the best place to put that because that's all about the starting of your application. Now you're mixing multiple things in one class. You're violating SRP, the S in solid. And really, there's not a whole lot of value doing that compared to creating a new file for those classes and methods. So putting other methods in here, not a great idea and not really of value. So we have a class that's only ever called, well, 0 times actually, but 1 time because it only referenced 1 time, you call the main method inside of it. And that's just because it's called magically. So we have a class that's not really necessary. So Microsoft said, hey, get rid of it. And we wrap all this in a namespace. Well, why do you have a namespace on code? What's the purpose of a namespace? It's to be able to reference that code. So the only reason we have a namespace old console is so we can say old console.program.main. Well, but if we're not calling main, why do we have a namespace for it? So now if we look at what we've done, we've really essentially eliminated the need for this, eliminated the need for this, eliminated the need for most of this. We'll get back to this, which there is a need for that. And we've basically eliminated the need for this as well. So now we're left with 3 sets of curly braces and console.writeLine. In other words, we're left with this. So when Microsoft looked at Program.cs, they said, hey, we're really lying to ourselves because all these things in here, the namespace, the class, and the method aren't normal. They're not things we do the normal way. They serve no purpose. The only purpose they serve is to pretend to blend in with the rest of our code, saying, hey, I'm just like all the rest of your code, when we have to know in our heads, oh, wait, that's not like all the rest of my code. Because it's blending in and saying, hey, I'm a method inside of a class, inside of a namespace. Well, any other method inside of a class, inside of a namespace, we can reference, we can call, but you can't do this one. Well, how do you know that? Well, you have to know. So what we're saying is you have to know a rule that's not stated explicitly in order to know how to execute this application. You have to know not to do something, and you have to know that this gets automatically called in order to understand the foundation of a C# application. Compare that to this Program.cs class is different than all the other things in your application, but this is where your application starts. That actually has less magic knowledge you have to have in order to know how to execute it. Yes, there's still some magic knowledge. There's magic knowledge of you have to know that Program.cs is the class file, or is the file that has to get executed in order to run your application. But that's pretty much it. Now, I did say there's one piece over here that I didn't talk about, and that's this right here. This is the one piece of all of this that I disagree with Microsoft on. This is hidden. It's the one thing in all of this that's actually hidden. And that's string array args. Over here, we can reference string array args. So I could say console writeLine args at position 0. And if there was an argument at position 0, it would print out. But where'd that come from? Well, we have to know it's magically there. Okay, so yes, that's magic. That's hidden, a hidden parameter. Well, that's not great. I wish it was actually visible somehow. You know, my thing is, what if we just did, string array args like this? Maybe put a semicolon at the end. I'm not sure, but that's not what Microsoft chose to do. They chose not to show it. And yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that. But that's the only thing that's hidden. And if we're trying to compare apples to apples, what are the magic things you need to know about? In this new way, the magic things are the string array args and the fact that Program.cs gets executed when the application starts. Over here, we need to know that static void main gets executed when the application starts, and we need to know not to call static void main. So it's kind of 2 for 2. But we've eliminated, instead of 12 lines, we have 1 line of code. So we've eliminated quite a bit of code, and even eliminated 3 indents of code before we start to get the right code. So this way is really the reason why it's the old way, is because, you know what? It was a lie. It was not doing what it said it was doing. Now, that still does leave the fact that your old applications still do this. And maybe if you create a new console application in your organization, you say, hey, I want to create a .NET 7 project, but I do want the old way in order to line up with all the rest of our applications. Well, this is where I really love the solution here, because Microsoft said, we get that. So if you create a brand new console application, let's create console new but old console. How about this? It's .NET 7, do not use top-level statements. There you go. It's the same practically as the old way of doing things. The only thing is, instead of using system, it doesn't have that because it has the implicit usings. And you can even come in here and turn off the implicit usings like so. And then when you go to build this, it's going to say, hey, you got a problem. Console does not exist in the current context. We need to add that using directive. And now you're back to what it was originally. So you can turn off all of these optional things that make your code cleaner and make it less of a lie. You can turn them all off if you want to match with your old systems. But the new way of doing things is much, much cleaner. And as a new developer, when you come in, this is much easier to learn with. You can say, hey, you know what? We're going to teach you about methods. This is a method. But until then, just know that if you say console writeline, it will print out whatever you put in here. Cool. Now let's talk about variables. And you can create a variable, int I equals 0. And we can say console writeline, what is I? And we can say, hey, you know what? We can change the value of I. So I plus equal 4. What's that going to be? Well, I is now going to print out 4 instead of 0. And you can learn about those things. And eventually you say, hey, you know what? Let's learn about methods. You can create your own little method. So you can say string test. And you can have your test method do something where you can say return hello. And then you can print in, you can say, you know, string info equals test, like that. You can get the value out. You can print info out. So now you're learning about methods, which actually technically this is a local method. That's okay. You're learning about methods and how to call this more than once. And then you can learn about classes. You can learn about namespaces and all the rest when you create a new file, when you create a new class. So it allows you to still learn, but learn less magic. Because right now we have one thing that's magic. Well, a couple. We run Program.cs. You have to know that. But besides that, it's console.writeline. So you can kind of go from there and start to learn, oh, test is kind of like console writeline. It's a method and it does something. And this is a method and it does something. So this allows for a much easier transition up the curve towards learning C#. So for a number of reasons, I really like this new way of doing things. I especially like the fact that it's super simple, so we can not have to eliminate a bunch of stuff we don't need. It's just that one line we can get rid of and put our code in it. So that's kind of the first thing I want to talk about. The next thing I want to talk about is the fact that Startup.cs was a waste of space. So let's do that. Let's jump over to a new project on our solution. And we're going to go here to ASP.NET Core Web Application, which is a Razor Pages application. We'll call it Old Razor Pages. And we'll say .NET 5, which again, we could do .NET Core 3.1 as well, but .NET 5 is fine. And we'll hit Create. And then we're going to, let's close all of these. And yes, we'll save all of them. And then we'll create a new one, new project, another Razor Pages application. This is our new Razor Pages. And we're going to say .NET 7. And again, we have this checkbox. We're going to uncheck this time. Do not use top-level statements. We do want to use top-level statements. Let's just keep that unchecked. We've noticed that, yes, top-level statements are good, and they're less of a lie than it used to be. So let's hit Create. So now we have our two versions of Razor pages. Let's talk about Startup.cs. Well, first of all, you can notice we have 10 using statements at the very top. That's a waste of space, especially since these are all common. They're things where I use over and over and over again. But let's not worry about that for now. Let's focus in on what Program.cs or what Startup.cs is. Well, we have the constructor where we bring in iConfiguration. Okay, got that. Then we have our configure services. This is where we configure dependency injection, which does, for the basic application, does one thing. Of course, as you create a real application, that will expand. And then we have the configure method, which is never called because it's actually called internally because it's a class that Microsoft created. But this is where we set up the development environment or the production environment using HSTS and HTTP redirection and routing and authorization and mapping our endpoints. Okay, this is where we do all this work. And we're doing it all inside of the startup class inside of our namespace and then inside of a method inside of that class. So that's the Startup.cs. Let's look at Program.cs, where, again, we have 8 lines of using statements that are pretty much repeated all over. And then we have our namespace, our class, our static void main, which calls one line. Okay, remember static void main, this runs until this curly brace, which this run right here is going to keep it open until the application is given the close command or the stop command, which comes from your web server. So this will run pretty much forever, which means we won't get to this normally until the web server gets shut down. But our static void main has one method. Well, okay, we call methods because we want to encapsulate some logic that we're going to call over and over, right? That's the thought, but one reference. Create host builder? Yeah, it's called right here. We create this method, which is actually, it's a simplified method, but we create this method that only gets called here. And this method calls the default builder. Okay, that's reusing a method over and over. Cool. And then it says configure host defaults, where it says, well, the only thing we're going to configure is use startup. Okay, so what this does, it goes over to the startup class and it uses this class to start up. So really what we've done here in all of this is we have created the defaults, and then we've said, run the stuff in startup, and then build that and run. That's the 4 things we've done on this page. And then we just do the rest in startup. So what's the point of this method? Why can't we just plop this right inside here and run it there? Because we're not actually calling, and I won't do that, but we're not actually calling create host builder anywhere else. We could have just put this in this spot and it would work just fine. And why do we have another class that just is called once to do this work? There doesn't seem like it's a logical reason for that. And instead we have this class that doesn't get used very much. In fact, it gets used once for just this. Okay, so we have all this stuff, or in the new way of doing things, we put it all in Program.cs. There's we create the defaults for our builder. There's where we add our services. There's we call the build method. So, okay, remember, we have the build method here. We have in Startup.cs, we had the add Razor pages. That's what we've done so far in these 2 lines. And then we also had the create default builder. Well, that's right here. So these 3 lines take care of this. They take care of this, and they take care of all of this. And then we have the configuration here that is, hey, if you're in development or if you're not in development, do this. And your HTTPS redirection, your routing, your mapping, and all the rest. That takes care of all of this method right here, which means we've done all the stuff in startup, which means we've done all the stuff here, which means we've done all the stuff here, which means we've done all the stuff here, which means we replaced 26 lines here and 56 lines here for 82 lines of code. We replaced it all with our 25 lines that do the exact same thing without going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to configure everything. So why would we do this? Well, there is no reason. This is the way to create a simplified system that does not leave anything out. Now, why would Microsoft ever create the original system with Startup and Program? Well, the reason why is because this can grow. You could configure more things in here, change the defaults quite a bit, and all of a sudden you have something bigger here. And Startup is broken out so that, when you have the configure services, that's configuring dependency injection, and that's, in one spot, so it's easier to see, oh, this is dependency injection. Here's all the stuff for that. And so it kind of encapsulates things a little better because it knows, well, yeah, for the demo and for the starting, you only have one line here, but the reality is you'll probably have lots of lines to configure your dependency injection. So you probably want to put that behind a method for cutting down the amount of code you have to read in one spot that's all repetitive and allowing the startups do one thing well, or the configure to do one thing well, or whatever. But the reality is that applications don't start there, they end there. So we have a simple application right now that fully runs. And if we're going to create a small application, we don't really change anything at all. This just works. It's only if we get into a more complex application where we start to see, oh, instead of one line here, we have 20. Well, now there's a lot more going on in this file. I might want to extract that out into a separate extension method and make it a little cleaner, kind of like this is. This is actually an extension method that sets up more than just one service. It sets up lots of services into our dependency injection. You can create your own like that. Well, but then you have the choice to do that. You can grow into the application you need. So what we were doing originally was setting up for a more complex environment that we didn't always need, and putting a lot of extra stuff in here we also didn't really need. We need to have two places for this logic when it's all stuff that we do to start up our application, which, where does our application start? Program.cs. That's the starting point of our application. So we combined both of these things, put it into Program.cs, and simplified everything. Then, again, like I said, if your application grows, you can grow your logic with it. But there's no need to have a complex setup when you might not need a complex solution. We add complexity to our applications in order to reduce bigger complexity. So, for example, we add design patterns in order to reduce complexity, but they're a complex piece of their own. So they add some complexity, but that added complexity is less than the complexity it reduces, right? So it's a trade-off. We add stuff to make stuff simpler. Well, in this case, we start with the simple and we only add some complexities like additional startup files, some extension methods, more configuration when we need it. And when we need it, that's when we grow that. That's when we say, hey, we're going to change and make things simpler by adding extension methods or whatever. So this is a great starting point, and this is a much more lean, trimmed down solution for us to start with. and it's prepared for us to grow, but it's not bloated already. Okay, so that's why I think that Startup.cs was kind of a waste of space. We didn't need to have 82 lines of code between this and Program.cs to accomplish the very same thing we're doing in 25. So this old way of doing things, yeah, you can go back to it if you want because it's still there. It still runs. It will still work. We can upgrade this old Razor Pages to .NET 7 just by going over here and changing this to a 7, and it will work. But just because it does work doesn't mean it's the right way of going. This simplified, where is it? There we go. I must have moved it. Sorry about that. Come on, move over. There we go. So this simplified version here is the one that's the better solution to make things cleaner and more understandable. It's much more readable, and you're not bouncing around to find different parts that are all part of just starting up your application. So that's my thoughts on Startup.cs. Now let's talk about one that we've been seeing for a while now, and I've been pointing it out, but just briefly, and that is this. Remember I said that Microsoft forgot about Drive for years? I didn't mean everywhere. I meant in one specific area, using directives. In our using directives, if we create a new page here, so we have our old Razor page, go to index, we get index.cs.html, we have 7 using statements, and 2 of them are used all the time. For example, this one right here, all the time, used all the time for any Razor page. Why? Because it's necessary to have things like the page model. It comes right from Microsoft.asp.core.mbc.razorpages.pageModel. So that comes directly from there. And logging, if you're going to use logging, we're going to have this every single time. System and generic and link and threading.tasks and MVC. These things are almost always used. Now, right now, they're not being used, but we have a very generic page. Once you start using any of our normal features like list, all of a sudden that pops up, and list of T. And if we do something with that list, it's link, and so many other things. So these things we've repeated over and over and over again as we go from page to page. And the first 6 to 12 lines of our code file is taken up with these using directives. And so Microsoft came up with 2 separate systems for handling using directives when it moved over to .NET 6. So if we look at the index page here, we'll see it has 2. And if we look at the error page, it has 3. And we could even say, you know what? Hey, maybe you don't need all of those. So what it does is it has 2 different systems. First of all, there is the implicit usings. So implicit usings are ones that are hidden. And if we go to the properties page, we'll see implicit usings currently is enabled. This is, again, coming back to the fact that all these features that Microsoft have added to make things better are actually removable. You can take them out. You can say, no, I don't want to. I want the old way. I want more lines of code. I want more curly braces. I want more indentation. I want more obfuscation. So you can do all of that by turning off these features. You can turn off top level statements. You can turn off implicit usings. But implicit usings are where they create for us some defaults. So if we look here and say show all files, and we go to the OBJ directory and the bin directory, and then in .NET 7, we scroll down here and see global usings. This is the implicit usings. So it says global using global. These are the implicit usings that are auto-generated for us that Microsoft says, hey, you don't need to have those in every file. Now, it's not everything, and it's different for web projects versus desktop projects and so on. But these things are available then to all of our class files in the entire application. So you don't have to add a using system directive because it's already there in the implicit using. Now, implicit does mean hidden. It does mean implied. And yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that, but at the end of the day, it's not a huge deal because these are not the same thing as imports. This is a confusion a lot of people have when they first start out. They've seen C++ with the idea that at the top of a C++ file, you bring in a library, and then you can use that library. That's not what's happening with using directives. We're not bringing in system. We're not bringing in system.io or system.threading. We're not doing that. All we're doing is shortcutting how we call these things. So when I say console.writeLine, it's actually system.console.writeLine. But because I have a using system directive, I can say just console.writeLine. So that's all it's doing is we're just cutting off those long namespaces and saying, hey, you can use the shortened version instead. And we're doing that for some of the basics that Microsoft uses quite a bit. And notice of these, only 6 are actually lit up right now because that's all that we're using, but more will come on board as we start using this as a real application. So that's the implicit usings. But if you notice, and we can close this out. If you notice, let's turn this off, that in index.cs HTML, we have these 2 entries. And up here, we have those same 2 entries plus a diagnostics one. And if we go down to privacy, we have those same 2 entries. And that's a repetition again. We're repeating over and over again, but not every class file has these, just the pages files have them. However, the only reason you don't add a using statement for using directive for every single entry in every single namespace is because of the fact that you can have naming conflicts. So if you had a class called console, perfectly valid. If you had a method called writeLine, perfectly valid. But if you have that in a namespace called, I don't know, new console.console.console.writeLine, that would work. But if you had a using for new console and a using for system, well, now you have a conflict. Which is it called? Is it called the local console.writeLine, or is it called the one from system, which comes from Microsoft? And actually, it calls the local one. But you shouldn't step on toes like that. You should know not to. And yes, there is some implicit knowledge there. But adding these using directives is not the end of the world because of the fact that most of the time you don't have namespace conflicts. If you do, then yes, you have to turn off those using directives. So if you found that, you know what, isn't stepping on any toes, I want to add some more things, you could add the implicit usings. I don't like that solution. Instead, what you could do is you could right click on your project. You can say add new item and say global usings.cs or whatever name you want to give it. Get rid of all this actually. And then we can say, well, I want to just get rid of that one. Actually, let's get rid of both of these since they use them quite a bit. We're going to cut those out and notice over here, we're going to get a red on the page model. We paste it in here and say global. And global. Save that. And now, no more red here. It still says Microsoft.asp.core.mbc.razorpages.pageModel. We can still see where it comes from. If we hit F12, we still can go to where it's declared, just like before, but now we have the ability to not have to have that repetition, but don't repeat yourselves. And this is the other part of Microsoft's solution for using directives. Personally, this is a personal preference, but I personally wish they would have created a file like this in our project that was the equivalent of what's in the implicit usings and just made it visible. And it said global using system, global using whatever, and not had implicit. That way, if you didn't like it, you could delete the file. And if you didn't know what was happening, you could look at the file. So it'd be a little more obvious what's going on. But otherwise, this allows us to do everything we want to. And in fact, if you want to, you can go back to your implicit usings, turn them off, and just use global usings. Bring in those things that are from the implicit usings and make them explicit. But either way, we now have a way to not repeat ourselves when over and over and over again, we're adding the same using directive, and we don't really need to. We don't really need to make the top of our methods massive with all the using directives that we need. And no, this is not hiding any dependencies. So if we take this away, it's not like you're hiding what you're dependent on. That's not how dependencies work. You really should have your dependencies brought in with your dependency injection. Just having a using statement at the top doesn't really tell you much. Doesn't tell you what part of Razor Pages it's depending on, what part of logging it's using. Doesn't tell you if, what part of generics you're using or how you're using link and so on. It just says, well, you're using that library or that namespace. But besides that, we have no clue. So this is not about dependencies. Okay, so that's the using statements. The last one I want to cover in this video is another one that has kind of annoyed people. I get why, but if we go, let's close all this down. We go back to, let's go to the new console and let's create a new class. So this is the new class dialog, love it. We can say person model. Okay, and yeah, the templates have not been updated in Visual Studio in a while. I'm not a big fan of that. It depends on what project type you're using because the templates are different per project type. So the new Blazor projects will have better templates than the console does. But notice we can just get rid of all this. We can put our curly brace or a semicolon there to get rid of our curly braces. And now we just have our public class person model. All right. And now we can say prop, let's do a string first name. Cool. And it says, well, actually, no, it's not cool because I've got a green squiggly under me. Why? Well, because it says non-nullable property, first name must contain a non-null value when exiting the constructor. And you say, wait, that's stupid. Why is it yelling at me about string? I know string can be null. What's the point? Well, this is the new nullability checks in .NET 6 and beyond, and it's something that is actually pretty important to allow us to make sure that we protect our applications against crashes, protect our applications against things that are pretty easy to check for if we just check for them. So what is it doing? Well, this string can be null. Did you know that? It's not really clear that it can be null, but yes, it can be null. That's again one of those things that you just have to know. Is that clear? No, but it is what it is. So string can be null. Whereas if we created an int ID, it doesn't yell at us. Why? Because ID can't be null. Because ints have a default value of 0. So it's always going to have a value in this integer. And if you want to make it null, you'd have to say, well, that's nullable. And now this could be null. You could have a null value in here. So you could say equals null, and that would be valid code. Whereas here, this is also valid code if you don't have nullability checks turned on. But we do have nullability checks turned on. If we go to the project and look, nullable, enabled. So if we turn that off, it would not warn us about this, but it says, hey, you can't put a null into a non-nullable reference type. So what it's saying is, hey, you know what? You said that this can't be null. Now it's matching the same pattern as this, even though it could technically at runtime contain a null, and it would work. But we're saying, hey, you know what? You're kind of indicating that this shouldn't be null, and yet you're putting a null value into it, and that can cause unexpected issues. And so what it's saying is unexpected issues are a problem, right? So let's make them expected. Let's be clear about it. And you have to choose, what am I going to do about this? So when you have this right here, you can say, well, oops, let's do a semicolon too. You can say, well, I want this to be nullable. Well, then just put your question mark at the end. Now it's nullable. Now you're telling the system, yes, there could be a null value here. Why is that important? Well, let's come over here to Program.cs. And let's come down here. Let's go up here. And we're going to say, well, actually, first, using directive. So using new console, we're going to say person model p equals new. It's not one of those shortcut things that Microsoft created. We don't have to use it. But notice that, why do I say new person model? I'm repeating myself. So I can just say equals new. I still know what it is. It's still a person model. It's still declared right there. But this is, I think, better than saying new person model, because that's repetition. And it's probably better than saying var, because now what's p? Oh, we come over here and figure out, oh, p is a person model. Which, yeah, you can do, but reading down, we read down and we can quickly see, oh, person model p versus this right now where it says var p, and I have to discover, oh, it's a person model. So I prefer to have this where I'm not repeating myself, but I also have it in line, much more readable person model p. So with person model p, I could say, let's do a int length equals p dot first name dot length. Okay, and notice the squiggly here, it says first name may be null here because this is a nullable string. So it's yelling at me and saying, hey, this could be a problem. And in fact, it would be a problem because, yes, it is null here. I have it assigned a value. Now, if I said, no, this isn't going to be null, and maybe I even assign an initial value, like let's go a constructor, and I could say first name equals Tim as a default, right? Well, then over here, no warning, no problem. You can do that because it knows for a fact that it won't be null. We don't have to do a null check here. Whereas when I am unsure about things, when I'm uncertain, and I say, well, I haven't declared, but this should probably not be null, and it's going to say, well, then I'm going to warn you over here because this should not be null. You've not said it can contain a null value. But if I say, well, yes, it can contain a null value, well, now it communicates over here and says, hey, you got a problem. Once it updates, you got a problem because first name might be null here. So it's telling you, hey, let's be clear about when you're going to use null and when you're not. And if you're clear about it, then I can tell you when you're making a mistake. So we've been clear about the fact that, yes, this is nullable. Well, okay, then this could be null. Now, if I come up here and say p.firstname equals, well, test is fine. Well, then guess what? No more warning because it knows, oh, there was a value assigned up here. Therefore, null is not a problem anymore. So we can do this without doing a null check first. Or we could also do this, where we could say, you know what? Let's right click and say snippet, surround with an if statement, and say if p.firstname is not null. Now we're doing a null check. And it said, hey, no problem. That works. I can do that because I don't have to know if this is null. I know that you've done a null check right here. Therefore, the only way this code runs in here is if it's not null. So it's telling us, hey, we're good. You've done your check. You've made sure that I'm going to be protected. But if we don't do that, it's going to warn us to make sure that we check these things, because this right here, now it's pretty obvious right now because we're all in line, but this right here is something that crashes a lot of applications because it's just that one time you forget, oh yeah, that's right, the first name could be null, and then you crash your application. So that's something to look out for. That's something that is really a big value to your application. Now, when you get an application that's already existing, let's say you have, a very modern application, only 10 to 20,000 lines of code, very kind of small application, and you turn on the null checks. You're going to have a lot of warnings to deal with because we have never used the question mark with string before, because string is by default nullable, just like person model is by default nullable. So when we have this, we turn it on, it's going to have all these warnings where you have to say, make a decision. Is first name nullable? If it's not, you have to assign it a value. And Microsoft's given us the tools so you can either say assign a constructor, or we can say that it's required, like so. That also takes care of it. What required does, it makes sure that when you instantiate your class, that it yells at you and says, hey, you need to set the first name. Okay, so we would say, first name, which is required, equals Tim. And now we're cool. So they've given us the tools to update our code to match and make sure that we're checking for these things in the right way and that the Visual Studio can help us. But this nullability check is kind of a big deal. Now, again, if you have an application that's, got a few lines of code in it and you turn on nullability, then what you're going to do is maybe turn it on per file, which you can do, or slowly build up over time. Maybe turn it on for a little bit and then start adding your checks, and don't turn on the warnings yet. Just say, hey, I want to allow, stuff like required and the question mark and so on. And that way you can start modifying your application, not go crazy, but it will make your application better. So the things that Microsoft has been doing have made our applications better. They have made them more clear as to what's going on. They have taken out a lot of the guesswork or even the outright lies about what these things actually are, and they've replaced them with things that are clear, that are simpler, and that are going to help us build better code from day one. Okay, so there's been a lot of changes in .NET 6 and beyond, and even if they were the right changes, keeping up with all those changes can be hard. So if you're looking for more information on a specific change, you can check out the 10-minute training series. I've got a playlist that's got a bunch of those individual changes with just a quick 10-minute or less video that covers them. And if you want to go into more depth and have a more comprehensive education in C#, go to iamtimcorey.com and check out the C# Master Course. It's one of the courses, it's the one course you'll need to gain a solid education in C#, whether you're just starting out or you're trying to keep up and fill in some of those gaps. It covers C# from the beginning, and it includes training in the .NET framework through .NET 6 and beyond. So you have a well-rounded education that fits any work environment. All right, so that's my thoughts on this. That's my thoughts on the changes and how really they're very good changes, and they are meant to make things clearer, simpler, not for the most part, not hide things, this notwithstanding and the implicit usings notwithstanding, but otherwise to make things clearer and more obvious. All right, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.